Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to Makin Sense, South Africa's best news podcast and the Common Sense's flagship podcast. As always, I am joined by a panel of brilliant South Africans scattered around the world. Taking a break from throwing oil at priceless works of art, the Director of Wealth of Audley Capital, the Liberal Democrat of Lambeth, Simon Lincoln Reeder. Hopping across the Atlantic, we are joined by the Director of the Yorktown Foundation for Freedom, the layabout of Los Angeles, Richard Tren. Joining us from the Common Sense HQ, the founder of France Cronier Private Clients, the editor of the Common Sense, the Umlungu of Umhlanga, Franz Cronier. And no, ladies and gentlemen, your eyes do not deceive you. There is a full head of hair sitting in James Myberg's seat. We are being joined by the first guest on Makin Sense, one of our favorite columnists at the Common Sense, the CEO of the Free Market Foundation, the knave of Northwards, David Ansara. So we have a jam-packed show today, gentlemen, but I think we'll start with you, Franz, because you have some polling that we did at the SRF in June that shows the kind of true economic beliefs of South Africans.
Yeah, well, it's nice to be here, Gabriel, again. And it's nice to have David as our guest, who I hope will fight with us later about our support, or at least mine, for the GNU, and say that we are as bad as the state planners of the former Soviet Union for throwing all our hope upon the idea of a huge central government to save South Africa. But what I think David might like is some of this. So this was done, when was this done? This was done in May and June of this year. And a question is put to South African voters. And the question essentially is, the government should play a central role in managing the economy and directing development. And when we asked this, 66% of all South Africans said they agree with that. They think this is the way to go. And if I just go to ANC voters, 79% of ANC voters said dead on, this is how we get the place right. But look what happens when we start asking more. That's an esoteric question. It's sort of at a sort of high level in theory. Now we're going to bring the question down to ground level and look what's going to change. So a later question in the same survey is if you sort of start a business, the government should be able to tell you what you're allowed to sell. And this time, 60% of South Africans disagree. It's almost exactly that. They say it's nothing to do with the government, what I sell in my own business. And amongst ANC voters, 54% now say no. Why is the state determining what I can sell in my business? So we carry on. We say that the government should be able to determine where you're allowed to do business, in what town or what city. Now 78% of South Africans say no. It's got nothing to do with the state, where we do business or how we do business. Amongst ANC voters, the figure is 72% that said absolutely not. This is not something for the state to direct. We then go on to ask the question, is now that you've started your own business, wherever the state has permitted this, the state should be able to determine the prices of the products that you sell and what you charge for those. The answers were that 63% of ANC voters said no, it's got nothing to do with the state. And 72% of all voters. Go to the question of what staff you're allowed to employ. Should the state be able to determine that? And the same thing, 74% of South Africans said it's got nothing to do with the state. ANC voters at 67%, and on and on and on. And it's a really useful insight into the difference between asking a sort of a general question at an esoteric sort of theoretical level and then asking the same question applied to someone's actual life. And that's Johannesburg outside going bang. The outside the window. And you can sometimes, my last comment on this is, you kind of have some sympathy perhaps for some populist politicians, because you go to a stadium and you might chant, seize the banks, and the crowd might chant back saying, yeah, go for it. And then you get into or the healthcare sector or whatever it is, and you get into government and you go and do that, and then you get 40% in an election. And the lesson is to be very cautious when you do this kind of research, to make sure that you're actually finding what people really deeply want. And the way to do that is to make the issue relevant to their own lives and give it a domestic perspective. Then you'll see where public opinion actually sits on an issue. Gabriel, back to you.
So I think there's this really fascinating insight that I'd like to kind of draw out that comes out of this research, that is that people generally don't seem to have a kind of good grasp, let's say, of exactly what people mean when they talk in very theoretical, abstract political terms. So you made the point on the first question that people, when you phrase it like the state should lead development, that people are in favor of this. And I think that the reason why people kind of generally are, let's say, on the esoteric level, inclined to believe that the state should play a heavy role in the economy is because in South Africa, there is really no kind of mainstream dialogue that exists outside of that narrative. You've got, David and his crazies at the Free Market Foundation who will make, counter arguments and who will, talk outside of the state paradigm. But really, the mainstream, as in the mainstream political parties and the mainstream media, have done an awful job of providing any kind of alternative vision of the interplay between, the state and the private sector.
Or they might say they've done a very good job, because what you get when you ask the theoretical level question is you get the conditioned answer. What people have been told is good for them. And that's why you've got to make the issue domestic and personal to see what they actually think. And there'll always be a contradiction between the two. A really interesting one we did recently was, is empowerment policy important? And that's not in front of me, but 80% of people say, yeah, absolutely. And then you ask a really interesting question, like, if a business pays tax and employs people, should it be required beyond that to get any kind of BE certification? And then people say no, because it's doing what the social good that we expect businesses to do. So it's all over the place, and it's a conditioning approach. The mainstream has bombarded people to believe ideas along certain kind of railway tracks. Very difficult to derail that until you ask the personal question. Then you see what people actually want. And when you do that on South Africa, every time the answers are just so positive and good. You really believe this country can absolutely make it, because the views of ordinary people are just it's common sense every time.
David?
Yeah, so I mean, the point that you made there's a disjuncture between people's attitudes in their personal life versus their public policy preferences. And you mentioned empowerment, and everybody likes to think that they achieved what they've achieved in life through pulling themselves up by their bootstraps, not because of some empowerment policy. But when you actually quiz them on it, then things are a bit different. But there's another paradox, Frans. Why, if voters have these reasonable attitudes, skepticism of state power, socially conservative beliefs, why do they insist on voting for African nationalist socialist parties, like not only the ANC, but the EFF and MK? Why are 2/3 of the electorate voting for this nonsense if they should know better?
Okay, good question. Well, the ANC's at 40%, polling a bit lower now, Gauteng in the 20s, so they don't in the main. EFF voters and MK voters are not voting for the policies of those parties. They're voting for something else. For the EFF voter, the kind of person, the average, would be a kid who's been at a rubbish school, can't get work because he can't get a proper job, he can't take care of a family and do what, people are supposed to do. And he's just adrift and has no esteem in society. There's nothing to give him that. And the EFF, with its militant populism, offers him the chance to belong to something. He can put on that red beret, and for the first time in his life, he's amongst peers who are sort of powerful. And that's the EFF draw. On MK, the MK voter did not vote for the MK manifesto. The MK voter voted in the main on the perception of Zuma's persecution. And Zuma's election strategy, the short-potted version of it, was to say, I'm a great hero of the struggle, which he was. And you conjure nostalgia, which is so powerful. And then he said, admittedly, I've made mistakes, which is that very important honesty of Bill Clinton when he was canoodling the interns in the Oval Office. And Americans just thought, fantastic, look, he's like us. I was telling the story at a briefing recently. I won't tell you which firm. And I was trying to what Clinton was trying to do. And someone volunteered from the audience, I am just a man. But his wife wasn't there. And we thought we wouldn't identify him for that reason, amongst others. And the third thing that Zuma then did, all three worked together, is to say, but look at what the ANC has done to me. It's persecuted me. It's abandoned us. And the three things resonated perfectly in a band of the ANC voter base, and they turned out for that. But if you do the same exercise with that we've described here, with EFF voters or MK voters, you will find the same thing. Deep down, if you do enough work to get there, these are in the main good and decent people who, because of their upbringing, circumstances, abandonment, the extent of populism, the extent to which the media has disparaged the alternatives, the more centrist alternatives, stigmatized the DA as one example of that, find themselves in these kinds of parties. But it's a mistake to think that the people who got there are what let's talk about what Mrs. Clinton called deplorables. They're not, and it's that even inside that EFF or MK base, if you ask EFF voters if kill the Boer is hate speech and terrible and shouldn't be done, you get I don't know if Gabriel recalls the number, but it's an overwhelming majority that agree that is a terrible way to behave and one shouldn't. So
it's close to 80% who think that either it's kind of uncouth and shouldn't have been sung, or that it is hate speech and should be banned of EFF voters. So even on Malema's most kind of easily understood issue, his voters aren't actually with him. They're there for another reason. Richard, you had a point?
Just a quick question, Frans. So I maybe missed it at the beginnings. This is new polling. Can we see any trends over time and attitudes towards this kind of economic freedom, or do you plan to keep doing this so we can track things?
I think it's the first time we've done this specific question, but so not answering this question, but broadly. For 20 years, I've seen SA poll data and done a bit on it. And of late, we've done a lot more of that. And this sort of thing has always been true. Public opinion has always been centrist, moderate, and pragmatic. And it remains that. It hasn't become that. But early on, of course, the ANC also just to pick up on David's point, early on the ANC did well in government, got the growth rate up to 5%, doubled the number of people with jobs. It was delivering the things that you would think centrist and pragmatic policies would deliver, and therefore its support was holding. And as soon as that changed, it lost the election.
Yeah, I think that that covers what we were trying to get out there. That a kind of point that the show will keep making over and over again. That South Africans, when it comes down to it, moderate, centrist, pragmatic people. It's not the people that are the problem. It's the disappointing leadership, as France would say. Although David might disagree with us in a second. But before we get to David, we're going to go to probably the biggest news story of this week, which is that it seems as though there is peace coming in the Gazan conflict at long last. And that peace seems to have been primarily brokered through the efforts of Donald Trump. And in quite a big piece of irony that happened this week. Before Richard, we get to you to take us through the kind of what's gone on with Trump and the peace deal. There was a big, quite an ironic moment in that the Nobel Prize committee decided that despite Donald Trump being, so active in securing peace in a lot of conflicts around the world already in his short second term, that was not good enough for them, so they awarded it instead to the Venezuelan opposition leader Maria Corina Machado. And in a very great piece of dramatic irony, Maria Corina Machado then dedicated that award to President Trump, and she said that she wouldn't be able to do the work that she is doing in Venezuela as opposition leader without President Trump's attack on the gangs and the sources of funding for the Maduro government. So that's just a nice thing that kind of happened this week. But Richard, can you just take us through, everything that's gone on with the kind of peace plan and where we are and where things look like they're going?
Yeah, thanks, Gabriel. And first of all, Maria Machado thoroughly deserves that prize. She's an incredibly brave, outspoken woman who has suffered enormously for the stance she's taken, and she's a great defender of liberty. So I'm very much in favor of that. And maybe there are future peace prizes. Maybe Donald Trump will get it at some point. But yeah, so look, Monday, what a glorious day, what a joyful day. And I don't know anybody who could look at those hostages coming home and not be moved to tears. And this is a great achievement, and Donald Trump deserves the credit for this. I don't know another president that would have had the trust of the Israelis and be able to use U.S. leverage against Hamas's supporters, the Qataris, the Turkish government, and bring all these groups together. The world dodged a gigantic bullet when the American people, in their great wisdom, rejected Kamala Harris. Had she been there, we would still be mired in this conflict. I doubt the hostages would have come home. Trump came in, upturned the diplomatic playbook, started with what he wanted to get, and then worked it up from there. And a great deal of credit goes to him, his team, Witkoff, his son-in-law, Jared Kushner. This is an extraordinary achievement of U.S. diplomacy and strength through power. So is that's right? No, strength through peace.
Peace through
Peace through strength. I'll get there in the end. But we must, of course, recognize that the real work has been done by the Israeli forces, by the magnificent soldiers of the IDF and Israel's other security services that have prosecuted this war in an extraordinary way. I think we will study this for many years. No army has been able to achieve this kind of victory in an urban warfare with such a low civilian to combatant death ratio. It's been an extraordinary achievement. Of course, they are libeled and get nothing but opprobrium from the world. But we must recognize that the strength, we got there. Every time Hamas ever conceded, it was through, in response to Israeli military action. And Bibi Netanyahu shows what a masterful politician he was and a tactician against extraordinary internal and external opposition. So this has been fascinating. To watch. It's heartening. Of course, now that we see that we've got here, we could have got here 2 years ago, had the West put the pressure on Hamas and on its supporters, like Qatar. But how many lives have been wasted? How long has this dragged on? Frankly, because of pusillanimity from the West. So Trump deserves credit. What do we see from those countries that cravenly recognize this fictitious state of Palestine, from the UK, from Canada, from France? they're irrelevant. Jake Wallace-Simons correctly calls Starmer the eunuch prime minister. And if you saw them at Sharm el-Sheikh trying to gather around Trump like needy little school children, trying to be around the big man, they've shown themselves to be irrelevant, and have debased themselves by caving to the worst elements within their own countries and for political benefit. We'll get to South Africa's stance at the end. South Africa's far more sinister stance in this conflict. I want to just make a couple of points because we don't have a huge amount of time, but I want to get a few things off my chest of what this war has shown us, and hopefully, please God, this is coming to an end. This war, since October 7th, has laid bare a double bigotry. The first bigotry being holding Israel to a standard that no other country would ever be held to. No country is expected to be invaded, to have its people raped, murdered, tortured, and kidnapped, and then not respond, which is what most in the West wanted. They wanted an immediate ceasefire. So that is the first bigotry. The second bigotry is not treating Palestinians as though they have agency. For far too long, we've treated Palestinians as though they are just sort of children buffeted about on the global currents, and not people who have made decisions. And we've seen since 1947, every single time they're given an opportunity to create something, they choose to destroy something. When given an opportunity to choose peace, they choose war. When not given an opportunity to choose life, they choose death. These are the consequences of their decisions. They must be held accountable. They have agency. And it's today we have Germany and Japan as great allies of the West, because after the Second World War, they were held accountable for their decisions. They made decisions. And it's only once they recognize the agency that they have, that they can finally take account of their decisions and move forward and hopefully start choosing life over death and peace over war. But until the world recognizes their agency, we can't get there. And I think we must also recognize another astonishing bigotry, aside from all the UN agencies that are beyond the pale. The bigotry in the media has been phenomenal to watch. And it was from the very beginning when the BBC reported early on that Israel had bombed a hospital, Al-Shifa, I think it was called Al-Shifa Hospital, and Jeremy Bowen breathlessly claiming that Israel had murdered 500 people in the hospital, when we find out that, of course, the hospital wasn't bombed. 500 people were not dead. Palestinian Islamic Jihad misfired and landed in a parking lot. But that set the stage for the kind of bigoted and biased reporting that we've seen. And Gideon Folter, who runs the campaign against anti-Semitism in the UK, was on the BBC recently, and he pointed out this bias. And the BBC, his correspondent there, said, "Oh yes, we make mistakes and we've apologized for that." No, these are not mistakes. If an agency makes mistakes, you expect, in some cases, it would be to the benefit of Israel, in some cases, to the benefit of Hamas. Every single time the BBC, Sky, New York Times make mistakes, is to the benefit of Hamas. These are not mistakes. This is an agenda. And, had he been alive today, I think, Joseph Goebbels would be salivating over a global media as keen to demonize Israel, to demonize the Jews, so engaged in this Israelophobia that it must be pointed out. And this image that went around the world a few months ago of a starving Palestinian child that was on the New York Times and then on so many other newspapers. And when we find out what the editors of these papers did, they carefully edited the picture to cut out the chubby little brother, because that would have interfered with the message that Israel is starving Palestinian children, a blood libel. But it was worse than that, because the New York Times then had to show this image of this emaciated child. And they knew that their readers would ignore the fact that this child's mother was perfectly well-fed and healthy and had a good skin and was well-dressed. They could rely on the fact that their readers would overlook this. and wouldn't be wondering what kind of a monstrous mother feeds herself and starves her own child. They knew they could get away with this because the West, we have a big problem in the West. Let me put it that way. I think Israel will come out of this stronger. On October the 8th, 2 years ago, it looked weak. We saw what a world without an IDF would look like. It's now the regional hegemon. Its enemies have been devastated. Iran is on its knees. Assad is gone. Hezbollah is decapitated. Hamas is a nub of what it once is, now torturing its own civilians rather than Israelis. But the West has a problem. We have a major problem, and I think this goes back to 1960s Soviet propaganda. Where do these ideas come from that Israel is an apartheid state of settler colonialism? It's a testament to the astonishing efficiency and farsightedness of Soviet propagandists that they managed to insert these foul ideas into the West that are so wrong, but we've bought them. And we have a huge amount of work to do to get rid of them again. So Israel comes out stronger. The West is exposed as not just weak, but sick. I'm going to stop that there. And let's talk about why South Africa will I think be seen as the quisling in this, aligning itself. Where is South Africa at Sharm el-Sheikh? Nowhere. Aligning themselves with people who murder children and torture them in front of their parents just for the added cruelty. Is Ronald Lamola going to go to Gaza now to try and stop Hamas from killing its own citizens? I don't think so, because I don't think they ever cared about Palestinians. But France, help me understand what South Africa's position is.
Well, and then I want to take you back to something as well. The South Africans weren't at Sharm el-Sheikh, which was on Monday evening the final signing of the peace pact that was hosted by Sisi and Trump. Sisi's the Egyptian leader. And it was striking that they weren't there at all, even as spectators. I mean, Egypt is in Africa, firstly. South Africa had been very prominent on the question of this conflict, and has a long historical relationship, parts of its government, with the Palestinian people, who I want to discuss with you now. And they weren't there because they weren't welcome. Much of the Arab world was there, and much of Europe was there. India was there, the key Asian states. And the South Africans weren't there because that collective, from the Arab world through to the Western world, don't see South Africa as an honest broker, but rather as a proxy for Iran and Hamas, who regarded the peace pact not as a great thing to celebrate, but as a terrible strategic setback and a defeat. That's why they weren't there. And over the past day, both in Parliament, in muted terms, and Mr. Ramaphosa said South Africa will continue to drive its genocide case against the Israelis. And in much stronger terms, the Deputy Foreign Minister, speaking in Malaysia yesterday, in very strong terms, really accused, on the back of this peace pact, accused the Israelis of being monstrous barbarians, and that South Africa will pursue Israel and its leadership to the ends of the earth to have them convicted of genocide. And I just got off the call now with someone abroad about the implications for SA. I just wanted this person's perspective. These comments are going down very badly in key places, particularly given that South Africa's trade negotiators are still trying to do a tariff deal, or nominally trying to do a tariff deal with the Americans, let alone a much bigger investment pact. And that one of the American conditions has been, look, just dial back the stuff on the Israelis a bit. And now we've not dialed it back after the peace pact. We've increased the volume. The consequences of that are going to be serious. But I want to take you back to something you said, that you spoke about the Palestinian state. What, and you said there isn't such a thing. What now for the Palestinian people? What do you do? Don't they, one, actually deserve a state? And secondly, isn't there already a Palestinian state in Jordan? And hasn't that been the solution throughout?
But Richard, 1 second before you jump on that, Simon.
Yeah, no, I mean, this is quite a serious exchange between France and Rich, but Rich did ask, well, he did say maybe Donald Trump is going to win the Nobel Prize in future for this, and that's absolutely not going to happen. And it's a piece that I've written for France this week, because as it happens, that in that room in Oslo is the epitome of the boomer logic. And that boomer logic has turned around to this peace agreement and said it was precisely because of the recognition of states like Canada and France and the UK, which is what forced the hand. You can't reason with these people. And so I just before this exchange continues, sorry, Rich, just not going to happen.
Well, look, maybe it was debased anyway. Barack Obama got it for just being, for not actually achieving anything. In fact, he made the world more dangerous. So maybe the prize is far less worth far less than it once was.
We wrote today or yesterday. Sorry, we've gone away, but we're going to come back to Jordan.
Yeah.
We wrote today that if, in addition to this, Trump secures an end to the war in Europe, which I think he might, he will be the greatest peacemaker since the end of the Second World War. And if he then doesn't win the Nobel Prize, then good, because the prize will have lost whatever diminished credibility it still retains. But my question to you, Richard, is there are Palestinian people. What must become of them? Do they not deserve a state? And the big question is there not already one in Jordan? And hasn't that always been the solution here? Although people pretend that, or who know, overlook this.
Yet, do they deserve a state? I don't know. They keep on rejecting a state. This was never about a state. This was never about them wanting a country. This was them about destroying Israel, them about turning the Mediterranean red with Jewish blood. So I don't know that they deserve a state. I'm not sure if they even think in those terms. Is it about Jordan? Yeah, maybe. But Jordan, remember, they were in Jordan. The West Bank was part of Jordan. The Palestinians in Jordan were chucked out because they tried to overthrow the government there. The Egyptians don't want the Gaza Strip. The barrier between Egypt and Gaza is bigger and deeper and more fortified than that between Israel and Gaza. The Egyptians don't want them because they are a destructive force. Do they deserve a state? Maybe in some generations when they are de-radicalized. And I'm hoping that maybe this new Gulf effort, the Saudis have made important strides in de-radicalizing their own society. Maybe there will be a proper effort, but it'll take generations. Until then, let's stop pretending. And if they want to be a destructive force that is completely nihilistic and sees only death and destruction, keep them where they are. Let them figure it out and let them learn and take agency. But I don't know. Maybe Jordan should just take it over. But there will be further. I think the human rights abuses of the Palestinians by the other Arab states who will not put up with this anymore, who want to move on and want peace and trade and prosperity, they will be the ones then forced to deal with the Palestinians in harsher ways than any Israeli ever would.
Yeah. No, that point is incredibly important and isn't understood. That the Palestinians really are the wretched of the earth. And that in the Arab world there is the Iranians see them as pawns to be sent to their deaths, and the rest of the Arab world are very grateful that Israel deals with what they see as the Palestinian problem. The Egyptians think they're a menace to be locked up in. I mean, they've been expelled out of Egypt into Jordan, from Jordan into Lebanon. From Lebanon into Tunisia and back and forth the whole way.
I mean, to understand the hatred, of the Egyptians, consider that when Israel was bombing Gaza, the Egyptians wouldn't let a single one in. They wouldn't open the gates. They could have saved thousands of lives of women and children. They chose not to because they understand maybe what they're dealing with here. It's a very cruel, this is a very harsh, cruel part of the world. We have to recognize that.
Yeah, and you do now have the question of Palestinian people, and the resolution of that question, I think, is important. And maybe to argue the point, if you are subjected to, which you did well elect, I concede, the types of leadership of Hamas that radicalize people to the extreme extent. I've seen polling data on perceptions of Palestinians towards Jews, which is frightening to read. They really should all be killed, is the view. Then it's very difficult and to what extent, if you're subject to that extreme level of radicalization. I mean, of course, there's personal responsibility, but if you were able to excise Palestinian people from underneath that kind of influence and actually come up with a state solution, and Jordan is home to a vast population of what are in practice Palestinians, and not that it's worth much, but I actually think this anecdotal stuff is worth a lot. I mean, it's been a while back, but I've sat in a few cafes in the West Bank and spoken to people. And I must tell you, I really enjoyed that. I thought these are good and nice and decent people. And maybe you'll all say I'm hopelessly naive on things, but I do think that outside of the radicalization of the ghastly leadership that the Palestinians have had and have sometimes inflicted upon themselves, there is a prospect. I think part of the prospect is a Palestinian state, But I think that is in the fullness of time Jordan. And of course the Jordanians during this conflict, in fact, it's very interesting that the Jordanian queen is Palestinian practice. So they have these close ties. And one of the things the Jordanian leadership said is that the worst abuse the Palestinians could possibly suffer in the Gazan war is to leave Gaza, which would mean to come to Jordan. And we must definitely not allow that. We're so on their side. We value them so greatly. We care about them so much that we will not allow them to leave Gaza. So exactly as the view was of the Egyptians, so it is in Jordan.
Richard, one sec before you respond to that, David.
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, your point around Palestinian agency, I think, is the key one. Palestinians need to choose what kind of society they want to live in. And you can argue that, well, for decades now, they've been terrorized by Hamas, which took power initially in an election and then exterminated its opponents and have been living under the grip of this terror outfit. But I think there can only be a future for Palestinians that does not include Hamas. I think the removal of Hamas is a precondition for a flourishing society in Gaza and the dynamics in the West Bank I'm less familiar with. But, it's the same way as Imperial Japan and Third Reich Germany needed to be destroyed as a political entity before those societies could flourish and find freedom again. But yeah, I mean, I think the point was made earlier around Israel now being a regional hegemon. And I like to think of Israel as being like a scorpion, small but deadly. And you don't want to mess with the scorpion and get on the wrong side of it. And I think when I went there in May 2024, the dynamics were quite different. I mean, we visited the north, and at that point in time, Hezbollah in southern Lebanon was terrorizing northern Israel. And in the highlands there was a buffer zone, like a cordon sanitaire, where civilians had been evacuated because anti-tank missiles were raining down on the north from Hezbollah. The dynamics in Syria were unchanged at that time, and not to mention the looming threat from Iran and the Houthis, their proxy. But I think the dynamics have changed really fundamentally, and I think that is owing to Israelis being prepared to defend their freedom. And I think when we talk about the liberal Western values, I think there's a temptation to think that that's, and particularly with this tilt towards DEI and wokeism, that's kind of like a kind of permissive liberalism, that you must just be really soft and accept anything, any threats to your life, liberty, and property. But no, it's the opposite. If you value freedom, you need to defend it, and I think that's what the Israelis did. And something that really struck me when I was in Israel last year was, I mean, we met with a variety of people, and there's that old joke that if you put 2 Jews in a room, there'll be 3 opinions. And
Yes.
this is quite a fractious, argumentative kind of culture, right? Like, Israelis often come across as quite gruff. I actually thought that they were pretty warm, but they tell it like it is, and they don't beat around the bush. And there's a broad political spectrum there of, I mean, people that we met were like academics and screenwriters, artists, military people, and they all had very different views on how the war was being engaged. They all had strong opinions on Bibi and his leadership. But the one thing that united them was that they all said, we are Jews and this is our homeland. No matter what happens, this is the only option we have. And I mean, for all the discussion around the right of return of Palestinians, I mean, if you consider that not up until the middle of last century, there were approximately 800,000 Mizrahi Jews scattered across the Middle East, in Baghdad and Iran and Jordan and wherever. And all of them, after the formation of Israel, were either ethnically cleansed or driven out and sought refuge in Israel. So that really is the last stand for Jews. And as we've seen, as Richard has accurately pointed out, there's rising anti-Semitism in the West. So really, if you're a Jew today, Israel is fundamental to your existence as a culture and to your identity.
Yeah, back to
Can
you,
I?
Richard.
No, sorry. Go
No,
to Richard.
Go ahead, Franz. Go ahead.
I just wanted to, when not Gabriel, when David mentioned the scorpion, there were 2 other scorpions in this deal, whose roles I can acknowledge to you. One was Turkey and the other was Qatar. And they made it plain to Hamas that you're done. That you sign, we do the peace pact, you walk the line on this, or else we cast you into the wilderness and we cut you off. And that was critical. And that an important step towards that was a very clever chess move about a month ago, when a missile was fired into Qatar and took out some Hamas leadership there, or attempted to do that. And that sent a strong signal to the Qataris and to the Turks of what was the next level of this conflict if they wouldn't comply. So, as Richard said, peace through strength.
Donald Trump was very upset about that missile strike. Do you think he was playing to the gallery there?
No, I wouldn't know.
Yes. The United States has a big base there. They knew this was coming. It's inconceivable to me that the US did not know this was coming. And I think it's going to be interesting. I don't know. It might take many years to find out exactly what was going on there, how much they actually knew, whether or not they really intended to kill them, or whether this was just part of a stronger message to the Qataris that they.
I don't want to lose track, but you've said something that needs a little follow-up, because people don't know about it. The US base in Qatar, and that it's vast.
It's a vast base. Look, Qatar is a complicated country. These people playing both sides here, spreading the most malicious anti-Western, anti-Semitic nonsense through Al Jazeera, and supporting the worst, most anti-Western, anti-American activity on US campuses, and at the same time hosting a US army base and using its money. So these people, this is a very duplicitous people, and they I think what they needed was a little punch in the nose to remind them, where the power really was.
And in the last month, they throttled back Al Jazeera. Not many people know that.
Yeah,
which really was one of the early signs of what was coming for Hamas.
Yes.
So the squeeze was put on them. They responded positively.
Yeah, the worst elements here, the Tucker Carlsons of the world, talk about the Jewish lobby and the amount of money going into Jewish lobbying. They ignore the vast sums, vastly more, spent by Qatar, influencing politics here, influencing culture, particularly on universities, spreading vile anti-Western ideas. It's going to take a long time. If we want to understand why that New York Times story, that photograph landed so well, it's because of that long-term agenda that's being played out.
And one of
Yeah.
the spear points of that long-term agenda has been, as Franz pointed out, our government at home. And we have one of the people who hates our government the most with us in studio today, and that is David. And so finally we get to come to you for the conflict to drive engagement, because you do not think that the GNU is a good idea, David. And we here at the Common Sense think that it would be so lovely if we could all hold hands together around the campfire and sing Kumbaya. So, David, could you please tell us why that vision of South Africa is deeply flawed and wrong? Because it sounds lovely to me.
Gabriel, I don't only hate the South African government, I hate all governments, as a good libertarian should. This is why I have an Ayn Rand coffee mug over here, which I'm sipping throughout this conversation. And look, but what I hate more than government is big government, and the GNU is big government writ large. And I mean, we at the Free Market Foundation put out a report this week, yesterday, in fact, where we argued that the size and scope of South Africa's government, it's one of the largest, most interfering in the world. So we have 32 ministries, this is just looking at the cabinet, and 37 deputy ministers. That is an enormous, big, bloated and crowded cabinet. And if you compare that to, say, Germany, which has about 17 cabinet ministers, Japan has 20, the United Kingdom has 22. Bigger is not necessarily better when it comes to the size of cabinet. So we actually recommended that if the government is serious about growth and about reform, that it needs to cut itself down to size. And we only think that South Africa needs 10 ministries. And look, big government in South Africa is not new. It's an old phenomenon. And we have a long history of state interference, including in the apartheid period, which denied people their basic liberties. But the GNU and its formation has only exacerbated the problem. And it's really this kind of big tent politics. There's free goodies for everyone. We can have our cake and eat it. Bear in mind that South Africa's fiscal deficits are growing. The debt to GDP ratio is set to climb to about 81% over the medium-term expenditure framework. So the tax base is being sucked dry by this rapacious government, which has an unyielding appetite for consumption. So we're not even talking here, about Keynesian fiscal stimulus. This is purely government spend, about 2 trillion rand in terms of expenditure every year on just paying civil servants, bureaucrat salaries, bloated middle management. And then, there's a lot of other state dependencies like the welfare grant system as well. And, if you have to look at governments abroad in the developed world, South Africa's proportion of state spending is about 33% of GDP. In the OECD countries, it's in the 40s. But these countries spend extensively on healthcare, education, and other more so-called productive areas of government spending. I have my skepticism about the efficacy of that spend. But in South Africa, it's really just to keep the bureaucratic class well-fed. And that's really what the GNU amounts to. If you think of just one ministry, the Department of Sports, Arts and Culture, the entire budget for that national department, which I would argue is completely useless and irrelevant, notwithstanding what you think about Gates and McKenzie, I don't see any value that department is adding. Will South Africans suddenly stop playing rugby if we close the Department of Sport, Arts and Culture? Will people stop going to the opera or to the theatre? I don't think so. The budget for that department is about 13 or 14 billion rand, which is about the same amount that the GNU was squabbling over in the beginning of the year during the contested budget. So, the scale of state spending is truly enormous. And for the size of our economy, approximately $400 billion US dollars, it's really completely disproportionate. And, not only is it expensive, but it also crowds out private investment and private production. So all of those bureaucrats who are working for the government, not only are they drawing a fat salary, including the ministers who are getting paid about 2.3 million rand per minister, not only are they drawing a big salary, but they're also not contributing productively to growth. If they were entrepreneurs or part of the corporate sector, they'd be engaged in value-generating activities. So that's not the case here. And, I think the premise of the GNU was, well, we need to avoid the so-called Doomsday coalition. But if you cast your eyes over the policy agenda over the last year and a half, what we see is a lot of doomsday policies that have been implemented. The Expropriation Act was signed supposedly against the knowledge of some of the larger coalition partners. We have the Basic Education Laws Amendment Act, which supposedly was a red line for the DA, but that was signed. And both of those pieces of legislation are now presided over by DA ministers in the Department of Public Works and the Department of Education, respectively. And I would say that is a very difficult situation for those ministers to be in now, having to essentially be the enforcers of these abhorrent policies. And so the basic premise of the formation of the GNU, specifically from the DA's perspective, was only we stand between chaos and order. So we have to do this. We're simply compelled to join the government to keep the bad guys out from the looting and the stealing and the national democratic revolutionary policies that will inevitably follow. But what we've seen is actually that, and the Free Market Foundation warned against this in May, we warned that if the DA were to join the GNU, that it would risk being co-opted. And in many respects, it has been forced to go along with the prevailing ANC policy agenda, which is highly statist, highly interventionist, is threatening private property rights, and is threatening to undermine economic competitiveness. And so I remain skeptical about the foundational premise for the GNU. I think there are alternatives, and we can explore those. We at the Free Market Foundation in May last year were, as far as I know, the only civil society group that was advocating for a so-called no-elition scenario, confidence and supply, where the DA in particular remains outside of the government. The ANC forms a minority government on its own, and perhaps it would have gone into coalition with some of the smaller parties in any event, but that it conducts itself according to two principles. Confidence is in supporting the election of the president and the ongoing role of the president, and supply, which is around supporting budgets. And that, we believe, would have given the DA a lot more leverage. It would have restored a certain balance of power to Parliament. And there's, I think, a bias towards executive action in South Africa, an assumption that the cabinet is where all the action is. But actually, in many respects, particularly after May 24, I think that Parliament is perhaps could become an elevated site of political contestation again. And if you cast your mind back over the last 18 months, what would you say was the high watermark of the DA's participation in the GNU? I would say that it was the conflict over VAT. And that was when the DA really stood its ground. It said, national spending's out of control. We're not going to pass this budget. But where did that contestation happen? It didn't happen behind the closed doors of cabinet. It wasn't Deputy Minister Sarapin who was the loudest voice against the VAT increase. It was coming from the parliamentary caucus of the DA in the form of Mark Burke. And maybe there were conversations behind the scenes that we weren't privy to. But I think a lot of the DA's constituents would have been very enthused and supportive of the DA standing its ground in that instance. As I mentioned before, maybe in the broader scheme of things, that saving was fairly modest, but it was a symbolic standing of the ground. And so you could imagine in a counterfactual situation, if Ramaphosa steps down as president and the GNU falls apart, or if the DA were to leave, then you could imagine a situation in which the DA still has leverage and can still exercise power, albeit outside of the halls of the union buildings, and rather in the corridors and in the burnt-out husk of the parliamentary building. So, I think we need to use our imagination. I believe that, ultimately, state capacity is failing in South Africa. And there's maybe some improvements at the margins in places like Home Affairs, where you can now get your identity card delivered to you in record time. The state's very good at keeping track of its citizens and also taxing them. So that's where it invests most of its capacity and energy in SARS and Home Affairs. But, if you look around you, anything that the state touches really falls apart. And I think that a much better strategy would be to say, well, if we believe in preserving what's left of South Africa's economy and its competitiveness and the value that still exists here, because there's still considerable value in this country, large pools of capital, a dynamic, skilled workforce, etc., then you need to disconnect yourself from the center in the union buildings and start pushing for decentralized forms of power. And that can be in opposition-controlled provinces or cities, or it can be at the community level, where community groups start to take over what were previously the exclusive functions of the state. Where I'm speaking to you from Johannesburg, if you drive around the streets here, you will see state failure writ large. It's everywhere for you to see. And the previous functions like fire engine services or security or maintaining of verges or painting street markings, those are being done by private actors now. The city of Joburg still collects rates and makes the lives of ordinary citizens rather difficult and sometimes gets in the way of them solving these problems themselves, but ultimately is ineffectual and is on its way down. So that, I think, is the real challenge, not trying to save this failing government through a policy of managed decline. You need to show a very clear alternative. And as your polling suggests, there is appetite for that. Helen Zille stands a meaningful chance of winning in the city of Joburg. So the electorate doesn't necessarily always appreciate the finer details of governance. They're not going to see, the Bella Act has been implemented, but the DA education minister is saying we're not going to pass regulations that implement this. They just see a DA minister in charge of a portfolio which is threatening their vital interests. And that doesn't scale very well in terms of the public communications. So I think much better would be to say, this is a clear alternative that we represent as the moderate center. If you don't like the chaos and the disruption that has been caused by ANC misgovernance or the specter and the threat of an EFF or MK government, then vote for us. So that, I think, is a very different reality to the one that we're in, but one that I think the DA should meaningfully engage with. Gabriel, over to you.
So I think there's kind of two responses that immediately jump to my mind to what you're saying here. And the first is something that I feel less kind of compelled by as a response, but it's the positive response you'll get from a lot of DA folks who go, listen, yes, what you're saying, it's not great. We don't have a lot of power with a junior partner. We kind of accepted this, but at least by having us as a big muscular part of this coalition, and that the government kind of sometimes needs us, we can act as like the adults in the room and direct policy and make the kind of subtle changes in the executive that will slowly push things in at least not as bad a direction. So we're getting maybe a little bit of improvement where we might have had zero improvement or just continued stagnation, managed decline. And then the second point, which is which I find more compelling because it comes from us at the Social Research Foundation. One of the question marks that our polling has kind of revealed to us, and we'll have to explore its implications through the fullness of time as we lead up into 2029, is that it is unclear if the participation in the GNU is having a positive or a negative effect on the DA in the minds of South Africans' voters. We've outlaid, in the beginning of the show, we outlined a couple of France outlined a couple of points as to why the DA has struggled to break through, but it's clear that they've been locked in kind of this 20 to 25% of the electorate band for a very long time. And by participating in a government with the biggest party and being legitimated in that way, maybe that is going to be a more important psychological kind of barrier overcome for the voters, so that in fact, although they could maybe they'd be more useful as an opposition in this moment, that in the long term scheme of things, because they've decided to join the GNU and because that maybe had the psychological effects of legitimizing them in the eyes of most of the electorate, um, that might prove to be a more decisive and lead to the kind of less centralized governance, because we hope that if the DA win an election, they maybe aren't so obsessed with the kind of running everything from Pretoria as the ANC in its national democratic revolutionary policies is.
So what are those big reforms that have come out of DA ministries that they can proudly boast about, or not even just the DA, other parties as well that are in the GNU?
We got a little bit of movement on Starlink. Maybe I'm not going
Look,
to.
if
I'm
the
not going to
reforms
try and
were
defend.
flowing out of the various ministries, I would be applauding them. But being more efficient at administering home affairs. I mean, I think to give credit there, I think border control has probably been improved under Minister Schreiber, and also delivery of basic functions. But I think that also kind of suits the ANC, actually, to give some of these hospital pass ministries to the opposition, and because they don't have to worry about the difficult task of administering the state. Something like education, really, you can't really reform some of the structural problems in that ministry overnight, unless you break the power that SADTU, the Democratic Teachers Union, has over that education system. You're not really going to get meaningful improvements in education outcomes. You need to privatize education and let private sector or civil society, like what's happening with Kuro, improve education. So yeah, I think the wins are few and far between, but the losses are mounting up. I think one of the problems with the Doomsday alternative is that it's always kind of lurking there in the background, and it's very poorly defined. Like, what does Doomsday actually look like? And also, if you're constantly arguing that you joined the GNU to avert Doomsday, it makes it very difficult for you to justify to your constituents that you're now leaving. So when Andrew Whitfield, the Deputy Minister of Trade, Industry and Competition, was summarily fired on very spurious grounds by the president, look, it was his prerogative to choose his cabinet, but the president has overlooked many a misgovernance, many instances of misgovernance by his cabinet ministers, but chose to split hairs over Whitfield. And immediately the DA launched a press conference and said, "Oh, this is outrageous. We're being treated so unfairly, and poor us." But then afterwards, what happens? We still sit here today. There's no DA deputy minister. From reports, the DA can't even have a meeting with the president. Hundreds of days have passed since John Steenhuisen and Cyril Ramaphosa have met. So it seems like it's a kind of all aboard the sinking ship of the state, and very little by way of building life rafts and saying, well, how do we actually deal with some of the negative consequences that are arising from this failing state, rather than just trying to manage the decline.
David, our occasional friend John Steenhuisen did define doomsday. He said the EFF and MK and the ANC would get together and they'd expropriate everything and print money and whatever else, and the place would completely fall apart. Well, wasn't he right? Hasn't he avoided that and saved us?
Well, that's a contingency of history, France. We'll never know. But I mean,
I
as
tell you,
things stand at the moment,
no, we'll never know. It might have happened. It might have happened.
it might have, but
Out of an
the
abundance of
EFF
caution,
might have
wasn't he right?
voted for the EFF might have voted for the constitutional amendment in December 2021 to dilute private property rights, but they didn't, because they wanted to be more radical than the ANC. So, and as we've seen over the last 18 months, both the EFF and MK have suffered from quite a lot of internal volatility and leadership changes. It's not necessarily a fait accompli that they would have automatically joined the government. I mean, the EFF tried at the last minute when they saw the negotiations getting away from themselves. But it's not like, even if they had joined, that they would have necessarily had carte blanche. So
how do you guys think, if we're all wrong and we shouldn't have gone into this GNU thing as strongly as we did, and we supported it very strongly and encouraged it, you mentioned confidence in supply, but even and maybe you just want to explain that again to people who are unfamiliar with the idea that you don't need to be a majority to govern a country. But then beyond that, from where you guys are, if this big central state idea is not the way, how should South Africa be governed?
South Africa should be governed via a system of federalism, and the Constitution makes provision for that. And a lot of the legal mechanisms exist for federalism to take place, but our political culture is very centralized.
Sorry, David. By a kind of system of federalism, can you be more specific what you mean by that? Kind of lay out what is federalism and how does it differ from a centralized version of government?
So a centralized or unitary form of government is top-down, that there's a concentration of political and decision-making power within the center. So whereas a federal system is a division of power across various political entities or units. So in South Africa, we have 3 spheres of government, and the spheres exist side by side, not necessarily in a hierarchy. I think there's this fallacious assumption that the national government kind of sits on top, and then that dictates to the provinces, and then the provinces dictate to the municipalities. But no, these are separate sovereign political entities. And the stronger those are, the more you can diffuse decision-making and political control and avoid some of the concentration risks that we've seen. Because I think the paradox of South African politics is, while state capacity has declined on basic things like the provision of electricity and other basic functions like the maintenance of roads and policing, rampant criminality, there's nevertheless this high degree of concentration within the center, within the union buildings, and upstream from that, Luthuli House. But as the state begins to fail, its ability to exercise that authority is also weakened. And so that creates a void, and nature abhors a vacuum, and something will fill that void. And it can go one of 2 ways. It can either be organized criminal syndicates, and we've seen this with the construction mafia, the taxi syndicates, the other crime groups that have emerged in South Africa in recent years. Or it can be something structured and orderly and that preserves order and preserves economic well-being and vitality. So, I mean, I think a good model for this would be Switzerland, for example, where there is distributed power. It's also a multicultural society, French-speaking, German-speaking, Italian-speaking, and Roma-speaking Swiss. and they live in cantons which have high degrees of decision-making powers. They can even differentiate themselves in terms of taxation. If you consider in South Africa, the provinces generate 95% of their revenue from national treasury. So through the provincial equitable share, money is taken from the national fiscus and distributed according to a formula, depending on your population size and your economic profile. Whereas in a federal system, like in the United States is a good example, the states or localities can differentiate in terms of taxation policy and also have sovereignty over the distribution of those funds and can target those funds to projects that are specific to the local context and needs and interests of the people who live there. And South Africa is a very large country. It's twice the size of France. It's roughly about the same size as France and Spain put together. It has 62 million people over a very diverse racial, ethnic, and cultural milieu, and things run differently in different parts of the country, and I think that requires a great degree of social experimentation rather than a one-size-fits-all approach from the top down, and that's very consistent with our philosophy of individual freedom. Why should somebody who lives in Muizenberg be subject to the whims of somebody else who lives in Messina, right? The guy in Messina maybe is a poor guy who's dependent on public health care. What does he have to lose for voting for NHI? He doesn't care if private healthcare is nationalized and transferred to him. In fact, that's probably an improvement on what he has now, even though we all know that the promises of NHI are built on very weak foundations. But what must the guy in Muizenberg do about that? He just has to pay up. He just has to accept the national vote. And you can try and vote harder, but ultimately you're going to get the same outcome. So you need to break the stranglehold that Pretoria has over the country and start to create alternative poles of power. And you can only do that from the bottom up. Joining the GNU is reinforcing the power of the center, or at least delaying the inevitable collapse of it. You actually need to start creating those alternative forms of power.
One of your arguments, David, if I understand it, is that none of this requires constitutional changes and amendments, and that your guys' read of the thing is that these powers already exist, and it's just a question that there are very few actors around willing to take advantage of them.
Or even legislative changes. Jordan Hill-Lewis, who seems to be a very effective mayor of the city of Cape Town, he wrote an op-ed in the Daily Maverick saying that in order to address the Western Cape's runaway crime problem, the Cape Flats in particular, there needs to be legislative changes to the SAPS Act. And only 2 words will, if you add them to the act, will affect this change. So basically, his argument was that the SAPS Act and specifically Section 64EC says that the municipal police may do the prevention of crime, but he says adding and investigation to that, those 2 words would enable the city to basically deal with violent criminality by empowering it to conduct forensics and other investigative powers, because the national SAPS, which has the exclusive competency on that, is completely unable to deal with the volume of investigations that are required. And as Hilda mentions in the op-ed, 95 out of every 100 criminals who's apprehended for illegal gun possession in the Cape Flats is let go. So, but our argument is that actually you don't need to wait for the legislative change. You can just start doing things. And to the city's credit, they have rolled out extensive surveillance capabilities, drones. Some of that stuff makes me a little bit queasy because it's kind of reeks of the surveillance state that we've seen in other places like London and elsewhere. But there is a redirection of resources. There's the LEAP program, the Law Enforcement Advancement Program, with about 1,100 officers, boots on the ground, and all of that stuff is important. Visible policing has a deterrence effect on violent crime. But ultimately, you can wait for a long time if you're expecting legislative changes. And this goes back to our earlier point. If the coalition partners are so cozy in the GNU, why doesn't Jordan Hill-Lewis call up the Minister of Police and say, hey, bro, please, can you just amend the SAPS Act quickly and let me get on with investigating crime in the city of Cape Town? No, that doesn't happen. And you must ask why not, because the ANC has an ideological disposition that makes it hostile to any forms of political decentralization, because that amounts to relinquishing political control. Meanwhile, young girls are being gunned down in the street walking on their way to school, and that is unconscionable. So, to my mind, the rising tide of violent criminality in places like the Cape Flats represents a fundamental assault on the vital interests and rights of those communities. And I don't think those constituents would have much patience for arguments that the DA often makes. Well, that's not our fault. Those are the guys in Pretoria. Our hands are tied. They need a resolution to that problem. And those people are DA voters. And so the DA, I think, in places where it governs, should be adopting an approach of act first, don't ask for permission, rather seek forgiveness later. Let the national government take you to court if they are so opposed to what you're doing. And you can say in court before the judge, look, the doctrine of necessity, this is what my colleague Martin van Staden has written about extensively. We have a duty to act here. If we negate that duty, if we just sit idly by whilst citizens of the Western Cape are being shot or raped or murdered, then we're negating our fundamental constitutional duty to protect their rights. And so I think the electorate would be on their side if they were to do that. The same goes for the governance of critical infrastructure like ports and rail. I think the fact that, you have an otherwise economically competitive and well-run city in Cape Town that has a completely dysfunctional port that sits on the bottom of the global port rankings from the World Bank and other entities, that represents a choke point for that economy. And, you can say, well, that's not our fault. But it is your problem. And, I think the philosophy that I'm trying to disseminate is one of taking responsibility, saying we're not going to wait for conditions to improve, because actually the actors in Pretoria are hostile actors. They don't want to resolve this problem. And so sometimes that means just go and establish your own forensics unit in the city of Cape Town. Get ballistics investigators to come and investigate the crime scenes and produce a dossier. And if the National Prosecuting Authority refuses to prosecute those crimes, then you initiate private prosecutions yourself. There are ways of pushing back against the status quo. And I think it's a moral necessity. The status quo just simply isn't working anymore. So we need some creative thinking.
Yeah, I agree. And I think there's the great lesson that the DA should be taking out of this moment is a kind of, I think it's a Maoist tenet, which is that you act when you don't stop your enemy from making a mistake. So you essentially you wash your hands of the GNU so that the ANC can make as many mistakes as it likes, and you don't become responsible for them. And then at the same time, press the advantage that you have to ensure that you maintain this kind of hegemonic position and extend the hegemonic position in the city of Cape Town to continually prove the kind of arguments against your governance strategy wrong. Because if you can finally take over the port and the policing abilities and those last kind of holdouts that the arguments that people make about why Cape Town isn't replicable and isn't desirable will fall away. But I think that covers. Thank you, David. That covers your opposition to the GNU, and we unfortunately are quite pinched on time. So Simon, we're coming to you to end on gold, because the price of gold keeps setting records. Because and I have done a politics and economics degree, and so I am useless at understanding what money is and how it is made. So, Simon, can you explain to this guy who has two thumbs and no understanding of what the hell is going on with gold?
So I was going to caveat the section that it is sponsored by, do you know the supplier list to Tembisa Hospital? It's sponsored by the complete opposite to that. And it's an astounding subject, especially if you look at the price since the 2nd of February 2021, which you started seeing this increase. And then in the last year to date, you've seen that, which is not ordinarily what one associates with gold. And what you're seeing actually is movement that it's more indicative of Bitcoin runs, for example, November, December 2020 and last year. But you knew when those were happening that a tanking was coming at some point, that in those typical crypto cycles. But based on history and the known trends, you've seen a price of what's $3,000 an ounce, and no real indication that the bottom is going to fall out. And if it does, it'll be in complete defiance of history. There is, to caution that, the example of the precious metals collapse in 2013, where gold, I think, lost $400 off its previous high in 2011. But I think it's important to tell our audience that, this is not financial advice. I certainly must distance myself as it relates to certificates and licenses. But what's equally important is to examine gold where it is now through a few philosophical dimensions, which may give an explanation as to why this astonishing rise has happened. Now, I think everyone should have their own understanding of gold in the way that you have an understanding of the concepts of religion and family, because for me it is life's work of fascination, and you should put as much effort into trying to understand it, because it will eventually come to you, and this is just me speaking, but it will eventually appear to you as the closest thing that you can find to everyday magic, much more so than vaccines, and even more than nuclear in any human endeavor. And that's because of the simple principle that it's been here for longer than we have, and it's going to be here for longer than we will. And when you ask people what they think about gold, they ordinarily say value, wealth, beauty, accomplishment. But when you look at it through the arc of human history, you'll find something more profound, and that is eternity. And it's very interesting that our guest, David, our very welcome guest, David, has a mug with Ayn Rand's cup on it. A photograph on it, because I immediately remembered that I watched in 2004 this old Pathé video of Ayn Rand addressing a group of students just at the point of publishing The Fountainhead. And she got up and she said that this is a book about gold. And it wasn't. It was a book about a gifted architect enduring mediocrity who ultimately triumphed. But the inference was very clear in that address that gold is this great pinnacle of all life, from Greek mythology to the Bible to Olympic medals, and amusing concepts in language. And I think, last week we spoke about freedom of speech being one of the pillars of civilization. Gold is absolutely a pillar of civilization and foundational. Going back to the point of eternity, and this is going to be en route to answer this astonishing rise. But obviously, permanence, or the idea of, is a hugely reassuring fixture in anyone's life, and that includes the idea of permanent value, which is the position that gold occupies, not just in marginally rising or falling price indexes, but I think it hosts that point of aspiration where people can genuinely see prosperity. And that answers the first part, I think, of us trying to understand this astonishing rise. That's instinct. In times of turmoil, people gravitate toward reassurance. I think also you can add in physical concepts in recent years, gold investing alongside a digital coin, Bitcoin strategy. The two together form a really sound insulation vehicle from human folly. And as I said, that's been a trend for a while. But then you've got to ask the question, are we actually in an era of enhanced turmoil? And I think you've got to be honest and admit that, yes, we actually are. And even normies could see yesterday at the IMF meeting in Washington, the spokesperson explained to the United Kingdom that this country is the subject of the rudest inflation in the G7. Then you've got major debt to GDP crises, borrowing costs, debt to GDP, America over 100%, Italy over 100%, Japan 200% over, and the UK at 100% as well. And so into that enhanced turmoil model, you've got to consider, I think, for purposes of this discussion, two other factors. And this is something that we've recently discussed and which France led a few weeks ago. And the first is the appearance of this mother of all technology bubbles with the AI in the US, and whether that's skewering or mudding other US financial data. And I think that the answer is that it most certainly is, especially as it relates to the cost of doing business in America, which is, for all intents and purposes, prohibitive. And then coupled to the bubble, and the bubble would be, it's bad enough by itself, but I think what you're witnessing alongside it is this accelerated distrust, more than ever before. Governments, institutions, central banks, and their monetary policies. And then, in the level below that, I think that you've got this evolution, or rather degeneration, of Western societies into these low trust appearance, where aspiration is vanishing on account of the cost of living and the inability of governments to defeat things like inflation. And then I think even below that, you've got like this wholesale rejection of this unnecessary, complicated, and substantively vacant ESG, stakeholder capitalism orthodoxy. And, as a side there, I really was hoping for a contagion in July when BlackRock announced that one of its institutional investors had withdrawn $52 billion from one of its low index funds. Because any serious gold investor will tell you that these government policy influencing behemoths are actually an impediment to honest wealth and value creation, which is basically the foundation of gold. But I think the most important thing that we could discuss outside of trying to understand all of the forces culminating in this rise is actually the most important financial discussion in the world that is not being spoken about. And that is whether America has the gold that it claims it does. And that is whether China has more of the gold that it claims it does. And And the working thesis, which I accept, is that despite the pledges to audit Fort Knox and this whole Doge cycle, that America doesn't have the 8,100 tons or 260 million troy ounces it claims. And if it's got less than that, the quality is probably not that of China. China, on the other hand, has been suspected of hoarding and not declaring for the last 3 decades. And to that, you're probably looking here, if you see it through a geopolitical skirmish, as the greatest contemporary game of show and tell. And I'll steal this wonderful British commentator's words, Dominic Frisby. He's fantastic on gold. And he says that he who has the gold makes the rules. And so, to a contemporary application, to end this little piece, I think the ultimate question about whether gold can function today as the backing for a monetary system, in other words, a contemporary gold standard, and obviously the answer is yes, but that would mean significant expanse to the current price, which would take it to above 80,000 an ounce. And that would be politically explosive. Not many people know that in addition to forming the mathematical formula attached to gravity, Isaac Newton was once the master of mint in the UK, and ultimately laid the foundations for that gold standard. But in addition to doing that, he was also a ruthless scam hunter. He pursued fraudsters nicely and prosecuted them. And I think that's a very important thing to remember, because when you look at the crisis of fiat currency and how the dollar has lost so much of its value by, let's be honest, intentional debasement, that speaks to both the human ineptitude and dishonesty. And real value behind currency is a concept of discipline, which is the most important force in fiscal policy. The management of money is disciplined, then society is orderly. When you have a responsible management of money, you don't have tenderpreneur capitalism. You don't have predatory capitalism. There's no space for the likes of Mitt Romney. There's no space for the likes of McKinsey. All of those models eventually are recipients of this trickle-down effect. So I think if you had to assemble a treasury tomorrow in a young democracy using what you have, using what you know, you could do a lot worse than appoint people who have a almost boyhood fascination with gold, this obsessive grasp of what it's done throughout humanity. Because in my experience, certainly in my investment experience, they are the most thoughtful people. Over to you, Gabriel.
David, a last question before we wrap things up, or comment?
Well, I just think it's ironic that a lot of the gold purchases are also being made by central banks. I mean, it's the ultimate admission that the fiat system is built on sand, because they see that as a long-term store of value, as they should, and as a reserve asset to check the uncertainty that has unfolded since the abandonment of the gold standard all those decades ago. So, yeah, I mean, look, I'm a Bitcoiner, and I think gold and Bitcoin share many properties, and the one is scarcity of supply. And the fact that no matter how high the gold price is, you can never really produce more than about 1.5% more of global supply every year in gold. I think that keeps supply down, and that uniformity of new supply, I think, is one of the reasons why gold has been durable, despite, apart from all of its other use cases and cosmetic attractions.
Yeah, absolutely.
Great.
But yeah, I guess the question is, in a digital world, an interconnected world, how does gold function in that sense?
Well, that's
where I think Bitcoin has an advantage, because you can instantly transmit value around the world with Bitcoin, whereas with gold, its transferability is maybe a bit limited. Maybe you could have some kind of electronic layer on top of gold. But, Bitcoin's even better because you don't have any change in the overall supply. There will only ever be 21 million Bitcoin. So yeah, I think as a medium of exchange and a store of value, Bitcoin has a big advantage there.
Yeah, and to your point, it's about the philosophy of implementation. If we were to implement a cover, you certainly don't want people like Rishi Sunak anywhere near it. You actually want people that have worked in investment banks and understand the processes and the irresponsibilities associated with quantitative easing. It'll completely eliminate that, which is a good thing.
David, on that note, you said that gold and Bitcoin share many similarities. A difference between them is that Ed Davies cannot use a Bitcoin to club Simon after this, but he will use a gold bar to do that. So thank you to everyone for participating today. This feels like a great place to leave it. And thank you to everyone at home for tuning into this week's episode. And tune back in next week to catch another episode of South Africa's best news podcast. I'm Gabriel Makin, and this has been Makin Sense.
Thanks, Gabriel.